Welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the other side of the coin that we were studying in our previous class when we talked about prosocial behavior. In particular, we're going to be focusing our attention on what sometimes is called in research antisocial behavior, but is also often referred to as aggression. Before we get into lots of different factors that increase and decrease aggression and some of the groups that have a higher proclivity for aggression and which types exist, I do want to first just define the concept of aggression. Because oftentimes when we talk about aggression, there's lots of misnomers out there as to what it entails and what's required for something to qualify as an act of aggression. Much like we had with prosocial behavior, there's different levels and types of aggression that exist. In general, aggression is just when we display some type of behavior that's designed to cause harm to another individual or group. Now, the important thing here that we need to make note of is that there is intentionality behind it. There's lots of instances of people doing things that harm others with no intent behind it whatsoever. Somebody might say, get into a car accident that causes bodily harm to another person, but there was no decision to do that, or nothing that would have been, I guess, foreseeable, that would have kind of been the point of some of the things that person was doing behind the wheel. That would make that outcome definitely undesirable, but not qualify in social psychology terms as aggressive. But in aggression, there's also another major way that we categorize this particular behavior that we want to take note of. Oftentimes, aggression researchers will talk about aggression either being hostile or instrumental. When we talk about hostile aggression, we're talking about aggression that's sort of reactive. Aggression that happens as a result of the emotions that have been evoked within us. You say punch somebody because you're mad, or you tease somebody because you're feeling jealous or worried or insecure. Essentially, if we're reacting off of our emotions and acting aggressively as a result of it, we tend to define those types of aggression as hostile. If there's some goal in mind, something that we would like to achieve through the suppression of others or through the harm to other individuals, then that's actually called instrumental aggression. And for many theorists looking at aggression, they like to keep these two things discrete. In reality, if we're trying to label what type of aggression we see in a situation, we do see that there's lots of gray zones. One of the classic topics that's been studied a lot over the last decade or so is the topic of bullying. Why certain children pick out their peers and find ways to denigrate them and cause them lots of emotional pain. For a large period of time, this was just considered an act of hostile aggression. Right? They were doing it simply to be mean. Many current researchers have contended that there's actually an instrumental component to it as well. Some do it as an attempt to make themselves feel better, or as an attempt to gain popularity, and in even some cases, as an attempt to make friends with those individuals that they are, unfortunately, because they're not really thinking about it very well, they're tormenting. This example is just one of many where we can see kind of both hostile and instrumental components behind the aggressive acts that kids or adults exhibit. Another classic example is what we see in sports. In football, obviously we have to be physically aggressive towards other individuals to prevent them from doing what they would like to do and vice versa. But obviously, if you've ever watched a football game, you've noticed that these things often go beyond just the instrumental aggression. Many individuals get angry, do things that harm others, and in fact, there are some situations where people have done things in football games that come at a cost to their team. Certainly is not a means of obtaining this goal of winning a football game for many acts of aggression that we see on that field. And this again highlights how even if we want to treat these things as discrete, define them as discrete concepts, sometimes when we look at real world examples, things do start to overlap and, well, it becomes a little bit messier. So we sometimes just talk about aggression being aggression. If we're looking at closer examples of instrumental aggression, I think oftentimes nowadays people focus their attention on things like bullying and how this is something that's no longer just seen as a means of harming another person for the fun of it, but instead a means of gaining some type of personal status or closeness with other individuals, either those that are being bullied or those that they're bullying with. But this is definitely not the only example of instrumental aggression out there that has been studied extensively over the years. Many researchers looking for ways to quantify aggression in economics have found very ingenious studies to highlight some of the things that we do when we act aggressively towards other individuals. One of my favorites ones involved this process of distributing resources and using the way we distribute resources to kind of give messages to other individuals. In one classic study that looked at this, participants were invited to come into a study, play a video game, a cooperative video game with other individuals, and then they were asked after the game was over to choose how they would like the resources, the pay for participating in this activity with another person to be distributed. In fact, we can pretend that you're in the study. So let's say you've just completed this game, and in front of you pops up a screen. This screen gives you the option of either giving yourself $8 and the person you're paired up with $8 for participating in this short little study, or giving yourself $9 and giving the other person $6. I want you to imagine what you would do if you were given these options and told that the person you were paired up with would have no knowledge of the choice you made or the options that you were given. They would just randomly be given $8 or $6. So you see this pop up, and make a choice. Make your choice. Now let's say in this study that after you made this choice, whether the 8-8 or the 9-6 choice, a new set of options popped up on your screen, but they seemed to be, in this particular case, directed toward the person that you were playing with. If you chose 8-8, you would see an individual get the option of keeping things at 8-8 or changing it to 5-11, essentially giving them $11 and you $5 after you, and they theoretically seen you do this, had chosen 8-8. If you chose 9-6, well, your partner could theoretically then choose to keep it at 9-6 after they saw you do that, or change it to 5-5. Now, if we're looking at these acts of aggression so far, one would assume in the first one that we act aggressively not because we're mad or trying to hurt the other person, but simply if we take more money for ourselves and give the other person less, we're acting aggressively because of an instrumental reason. We're doing it for profit. If, however, we saw a person choose 8-8 afterward, after we've chosen 8-8, well, we'd probably be inclined to be equitable. If, say, we chose 8-8 and somebody chose 5-11, well, we might have certain emotions evoked. If we chose 9-6 and the next person chose 9-6, we'd probably feel another way. And if we chose 9-6 and somebody chose 5-5, well, they might be sending us a message, but that might be something that's perceived in a specific way. In this particular study, after the partner had supposedly chosen an option, people were then given a last final set of options that they were told, yes, your partner can see, but this will be how the money is going to be distributed. And in fact, in most studies, they did distribute the money accordingly. So in the case where people chose 8-8, when their partner chose 8-8, they were given the choice of just keeping it at 8-8 or dropping out $2 from their partner with no real reward to them. What they found, which was predictable, is that most people kept it at 8-8. And unless somebody wasn't paying attention, essentially, they just kept the status quo going. If somebody chose 8-8, though, and their partner then greedily chose 11-5, or I guess 5-11 we could call it, and people were given the choice of keeping it at 5-11 or suddenly changing it to 4-4, a really interesting effect emerged. much like a football player hitting another person after a play and drawing a penalty and hurting their team. Many individuals essentially acted aggressively, lashed out at the person they were paired up with, even though they knew it came at a cost to themselves. Which meant in the 511 case, many people actually chose to bring the money distribution back to 4-4 instead of keeping it at 511, foregoing $1 just to teach that greedy person they were paired up with a lesson. The people that chose 9-6 and then were paired up with the partner that chose 5-5 were then given the option of keeping it at 5-5 or making it 5-3. Now, most people did keep it at 5-5. It's important to note that. But there were a decent number, significant number of people that chose to punish somebody that essentially was punishing them. A big percentage of people, even though it wasn't the majority, did choose to redistribute the funds at 5-3 after they themselves had been taught a lesson, which seems kind of ironic considering that most people in the other condition felt very slighted when the other person was greedy and decided to teach that person a lesson themselves. It's like it's okay to teach somebody else a lesson, but being taught a lesson ourselves is not acceptable. When people got greedy, chose 9-6, and then were paired up with another partner that chose 9-6, well, nobody really in this condition chose 9-4. Most people kept it at 9-6 when that popped up. And I know this has a lot of complexity to it, but what it highlights is different reasons for aggression when we talk about how we distribute resources. It suggests that we can use taking or giving something to an individual as a way of communicating that we're unhappy or happy with that person. We can also, if we find somebody not allocating resources equally, a lot of individuals becoming upset and acting out in an aggressive way, even if it comes at a cost to them. Now, just as a small caveat to this, before we close out this example, it's probably important and kind of fun to note that more often than not, when people went through these sequences, the person they were paired up with was not making the second choice. Instead of everybody that was playing with somebody else then saw this same criteria unfold. So if they chose 8-8 and the next person, or theoretically the next person had the next choice, it wasn't another individual participating with them that made the choice. It was a random computer that chose half the time 8-8 and the other half of the time to distribute the money at 5-11, which is sort of depressing if you think about the fact that many people then, if they did have it randomly show up at 5-11, chose 4-4. If you're looking for the point of that, we're foregoing $1 to teach a random number generator a lesson. And in fact, it did cause a lot of frustration. There were examples in some of these studies that have looked at this of people getting up trying to find their partner because of how upset they were with the other person that they were working with on the study. This can really evoke a lot of emotions in the right conditions. But the big point I want you to get from this is that there are ways to act aggressively in order to send a message to another person. Now, there are also other ways to act instrumentally aggressive towards another individual that we haven't covered thus far. We, in our previous class on prosocial behavior, talked about how many individuals in the prisoner's dilemma would do undue harm to the person they were paired up with, really because their focus was on themselves. So they'd often opt for things that would hurt the group as a whole more so they could ensure that they themselves got the best out of each situation. This is certainly not the only situation where this self-focus has been studied over the years. Another classic economic approach that's been explored is this thing that we call the commons dilemma. The general gist of the commons dilemma is that you have a shared resource that if everybody is just, I guess, not greedy about things and shares things equally, then shared resource has enough supplies, enough value to kind of give everybody what they need. The example that many theorists and economists give is this grassy area where you can have multiple shepherds use it if they're careful to not overeat or I guess overuse the grassy area. Don't let your goats or cows or whatever go in that area too often and all the shepherds in the area can thrive. Well, what tends to happen with this commons dilemma is one shepherd tends to cheat a little bit, which entices the next shepherd to cheat a little bit, and so on until those resources are quickly depleted and nobody really gets what they want. Unfortunately, there's lots of economic examples of this occurring, and there's even political examples of this happening between countries and states and other places. It's a big issue, and it's not necessarily, again, an issue that's nestled in this attempt to harm others. It's a byproduct of people focusing on themselves and trying to get the most out of the situation that they can. And it really highlights, again, how when we're talking about aggression, it can exist in theoretically just an instrumental form, but the end product sometimes gets a little bit more complex. And this leads us to a really interesting question. There's all these examples of people being aggressive. Is this something that's just biologically pre-programmed in us? This is actually a question that was asked by many researchers over 6 decades ago at this point, when they started to try to dissect how inherent aggression was really across the world, and not just amongst humans, but amongst numerous species. There were some researchers that focused their attention on how aggression could be coaxed out of specific groups, and also where there might be specific groups that have a high proclivity or low proclivity for aggression. One researcher that got a lot of notoriety in the 1960s was this researcher named Eibel Eibensfeld, who ran these studies suggesting that critical periods during early childhood development seem to be big catalysts for aggressive tendencies in multiple species. One of Eibel Eibensfeld's famous studies was one where he raised rats in a complete isolation, all on their own, and others in communities where there were massive amounts of rats all over the place. What he found was that the rats raised in captivity, in actually solitary confinement, tended to have much higher rates of aggression and frustration with other rats. And in fact, some of them who had been confined their entire life and not had exposure to any other animals other than maybe an occasional lab assistant tended to be so aggressive that it was unsafe to put these rats around any other species, period. There's also another researcher named Kuo who at about the same time was looking at critical periods in a slightly different way, trying to show that not only could impoverished environments and isolation cause increased levels of aggression, but these same situations could trigger decreases in aggression towards things that we have a natural proclivity to be aggressive towards. In one really cute study that Kuo ran, he raised cats and rats at very young ages in the same cages, had them interact with each other for an extended period of time, and essentially allowed them to grow up with each other. And what Kuo found was not only was it very rare for there to be any acts of aggression between these two animals, but these limited acts of aggression transcended beyond just the fellow animal that they were paired up with. Cats raised with that one rat would have much lower rates of aggression towards other rats, even ones that they'd never met before. And the rats, probably much to their detriment, that were raised with cats, did not show any fear or an increased level of aggression towards cats that weren't the one that they were paired up with. And all of this highlighted for researchers for the very first time that when we talk about aggression, there might be some critical components in childhood that we want to pay extra special attention to. There's also more research that's highlighted the value of childhood and creating the right environments. We started looking for specific primate species that had much lower rates of aggression than others. Unfortunately, most research on aggression with primates has suggested that a large number of our primate species are inherently very aggressive. There's numerous studies that have shown that chimpanzees, gorillas, other primates do have a tendency to be much more prosocial for in-group members or family members, but when you go beyond those circles, aggression rates tend to spike. But We have found over the years that there are certain groups within primates that do have much lower levels of aggression. The one that's often cited the most are these chimpanzees that we call bonobos. You also sometimes hear them called pygmy chimps. Now, if we were in an in-person class, I'd be showing you a very awkward video about how bonobos have caught the attention of social psychologists over the years, partially because of their low rates of aggression, but also because of this culture that they seem to have created, where their way of resolving conflict is to constantly engage in sexual activity anytime any hostility is raised. And this sexual activity is not something that's done in private, it's done in public, oftentimes in front of children. And the belief of many people studying this species is that this early exposure of young children gives them some of the tools that they eventually start to utilize themselves when they look for ways to calm themselves, when they look for ways to kind of lower aggressive tendencies. Now, it's probably important to note at this point that this is not going to be something I'm suggesting we all try to do at the end of this lecture. I'm not saying that this is the only way to quell aggressive tendencies or that sex causes people to be less aggressive overall throughout their lifetime, but this type of stuff is something that we looked at a number of decades ago to look for inklings as to whether or not we could create environments, we could create childhood stimuli that pushed us to be more or less aggressive. And it eventually led to research that started to look at human beings as well. Numerous studies on human beings have also shown a wide range of aggressive tendencies as we started to study them in the same scientific way we studied other species. There have been numerous researchers and sociologists that have gone across cultures and tried to show that there were very aggressive groups in some areas and very non-aggressive groups in other areas that all seem to kind of have certain things in the environment and childhood that were the catalyst for these kind of low aggressive rates. The Pygmy tribes of Central Africa were one of the first groups that social psychologists looked for to kind of see how a group could create this kind of very non-aggressive society in a very aggressive environment. Unfortunately, they didn't have a large amount of time to study many of the Pygmy tribes that had developed such non-aggressive tendencies when Europe started to go into Africa and look at places, because many of these individuals within these tribes were kind of wiped out by their tribal neighbors and some European conquerors. This problem of kind of being able to study these Pygmy tribes extensively is sort of frustrating for social psychologists, but it really speaks to a concern that many cultural researchers have had for years, that maybe groups with low aggression tendencies have those tendencies for only a short period of time, because eventually the groups with the higher aggressive tendencies tend to wipe those less aggressive groups out. But we have found persistent groups that have low rates of aggression even today. Another group that gained a lot of attention over the last couple decades were the Inuits of Alaska. Many researchers flocked up to different regions of Alaska where these tribes or groups lived with them, studied them extensively to try to understand why rates of aggression, violence, murders, crime were so unbelievably low within these groups. They looked at the childhood upbringings of many of these individuals within these communities. They looked at the kind of legal system that they had, if we would call it that. They looked at some of the family structures that seemed to be very prevalent in a lot of these groups. And what they continually found was that for many of these individuals, it wasn't that they were just naturally born non-aggressive, but the structures that the community had created, the ways the society was able to kind of isolate itself from other groups, allowed them to develop this very non-aggressive society that's not commonly replicated across many groups. And as we looked at these groups, it's also important to note that many researchers in the 70s, 80s, and beyond also clearly identified certain groups that had much higher rates of aggression, and also groups that had certain things that seemed to trigger aggression within them that was not a universal thing across different groups. One of the classic examples that's cited in both the book and numerous studies in the 90s is this concept of something called Southern honor. This kind of cultural thing that developed in the South of the United States a number of decades ago that somehow led many males within this culture to conclude that if their honor or something relating to it was slighted, it was their responsibility to act in a way that was extremely aggressive toward another individual. In fact, there was a really interesting study done by 4 researchers at the University of Michigan where they invited people to come in and participate in the study. And what they didn't know was they'd only recruited males, and these males happened to come from one of 2 areas, from the South or from what's considered the North, which was, for this case, usually Michigan. Before people came in to participate in this study, there was a brief confrontation that occurred where a gentleman leaving the experiment ran into these individuals and said some offensive statement to the males that were coming in to participate. Afterwards, these males then had an opportunity to act aggressively toward another person that had nothing to do with the original confrontation or be participative in this study. And what they found was not only were many of the male participants from the South significantly more aggressive in the second component to the study, the chance to actually be aggressive toward a person that had nothing to do with the original confrontation, but many of these males from the South escalated the situation, the original confrontation, dramatically, to where, unfortunately, Cohen, Nesbitt, and Bodel and Schwartz had to put in several kind of fail-safes to prevent something from escalating out of control when the original confrontation that they had designed occurred. And all of this, again, highlights how there are variations in aggressive tendencies amongst humans, just like there's variations in aggressive tendencies across a large number of species, and that early experiences, cultural things, environmental things seem to be big players in not only our overall rates of aggression, but the things that trigger aggressive tendencies within people. And this might lead you to ask, well, all right, are there certain subgroups within the population that have these aggressive tendencies for almost all cultures? And I'm guessing your mind, when you hear that, almost automatically leads to something that's cited in many studies of crime and aggression on a regular basis. The fact that there is a really big gender difference when we talk about aggression. When we look at acts of aggression committed in terms of crimes and fights and other things, what we do see is that individuals identifying as male tend to commit about 10 times the amount of aggressive acts as individuals identifying as female. At least if we look at the quantifiable acts of aggression. Now, there has been some pushback on this recently that suggested that even though females might not be getting in as many physical conflicts as males, it doesn't mean that they're not acting aggressively. There's many research studies that have shown that cyberbullying and other things is actually something that happens a little bit more with females than males. But even if we look at the different types of aggression and control for that, what most researchers have concluded is that there is a pretty substantial difference between men and women in terms of aggressive tendencies. And this has led lots of people to say, why? Why is this group within the population so much more aggressive than the other across most cultures? One theory that's been proposed is this thing called the precarious manhood hypothesis. That maybe there's something about being a male within every culture, and this needs to be able to pass on our genes and be seen as superior, that it leads inherently to these higher rates of aggression within males. In species where maybe there's a difference in whether or not males get to kind of pass on their seed based on their ability to survive, this theory suggests that in those species maybe we wouldn't see that aggression. But in the other ones, like in humans, well, this is just considered an inherent thing. This also has been linked, if we're looking at rates of aggression in males, to biology. Some researchers have suggested that maybe testosterone and other hormones floating through our system that impact not only our body's function but our brain might make us significantly more aggressive. Some studies have shown that higher rates of testosterone in males tend to lead to larger sizes of males and, well, just changes in the overall body structure of males. And as the body changes, as testosterone levels rise, we do see a correlation between those things and aggressive tendencies. The correlation isn't extremely strong, mind you. It's not this absolute thing where if you're a male that's muscular and tall, you're automatically extremely aggressive. But when we look at extremes, we do see this correlation becoming even stronger. There were actually studies done there. They went into prisons and fraternities and asked individuals within these groups to identify the most aggressive males within these groups. And what they almost always found was that the ones that were rated extremely aggressive by their peers tended to have testosterone levels that were through the roof in comparison to the normal population. And all of this highlighted again the fact that there might be a biological component to aggression when we look at testosterone and other changes that occur as a result of this, well, more masculine hormone that exists. And in fact, there have been studies in the past that have suggested that this is not just a correlational thing, but a causal thing. There was a researcher named Moyer in the 1980s that intentionally injected male rats with testosterone and then exposed them to different conditions that gave them opportunities to act aggressively. And what Moyer found, and this has been replicated by others, is that as testosterone increased in these rats, they did become more aggressive towards other rats. And this is something that seems to be the case for humans as well. It's not absolute. We all react to hormones differently. But since testosterone does do things like increase our heart rate, it causes us to kind of be more physically active, there's the potential that correlation is not just correlational. There could be causal factors involved, even if it is much more complex than just a one-on-one thing. And this leads us to our discussion of social factors. We've sort of alluded to some things already about things in the environment that can trigger aggressive tendencies. We've discussed how instilling certain emotions, in particular anger, within individuals can trigger aggressive tendencies within people. This is something we're going to look at extensively as we progress into the next half of this module. But I do want us to recognize that there is a clear connection between feelings of anger, feelings of fear, and increased rates of aggression. But there are things that can really exacerbate this effect. As we've talked about, things like gender and testosterone and specific childhood environments might be big catalysts to increasing the likelihood that anger leads to aggression. But there's also some studies that have shown that just having violent cues within the environment can also trigger aggressive tendencies as well. In one particular study done by a pair of researchers named Berkowitz and LePage, they had participants come in and participate in a learning activity. Now, in one situation, people in this learning activity were given prompts that allowed them to be relatively successful and only get shocked once or twice when they themselves were the learner. It's probably important to note that shocking was entirely arbitrary, and the person shocking the other person was told just to zap this participant, true participant, when they felt that that person needed it. And in one condition, the Confederate, the person theoretically shocking the other person to teach them, only shocked them once in this relatively easy task. Then these individuals were asked in this one condition to shock another participant in a similar task, and they measured how long that person pushed the button to shock the other individual. And what they found was when people were only shocked once, they weren't really put into a situation where they were angry, They were pretty nice to the person they were paired up with, and they very rarely shocked the person, and how long they shocked them was very, I guess, limited. But when people were shocked several times when they were participating in this learning task, and then they were asked to shock another participant, what they found was that that anger tended to trigger higher rates of shocking and much, much longer pressing of the shock lever. What made this even more interesting, and this is when we get to the cues component, was that when people were in environments that seemed to suggest hostility or physical aggression, the people suppressed that shock lever even longer. When people were in a room with just a bunch of random weapons like guns and other things not really relating to shock, they pressed the lever about 0.05 of a second more. Definitely significantly more, just a little bit more if we're talking about it on a quantifiable level. If people were in a room filled with associated shocking instruments and other things that kind of highlighted the learning process, they suppressed the lever even more, an extra 0.07 of a second. And all of this, sorry, thousandths of a minute, hundredths of a second essentially, this highlighted how when we're angry, we do act more aggressively, but if we're also in a place where there's cues relating to aggression, now that triggers even more aggression within us. It's also something that's been tied to another environmental thing that has been long known to be associated with aggression, and that's heat. You might have heard the phrase, and the book talks about it being hot in the collar, and it's suggesting that you're more prone to anger when you have this heat that's put on you. In the 1970s, numerous studies showed that we can actually correlate the temperature on a day within a city and crime rates within those cities. And this has been done for multiple cities, not only in the United States, but across the world. We've also been able to show in other studies that if we manipulate the room that people are participating in, we can get them to be more aggressive towards other individuals through either shocking them or doing things that are defined as more aggressive based on the study design. It's important to note, though, that it doesn't mean that if somebody's in a hot environment their entire life that they're inherently going to be aggressive. Many people live in very hot places, and it doesn't mean that they're all engaging in fist fights on a regular basis. And many species spend a large amount of time in very hot places, but they don't inherently have aggressive tendencies. But if there is a comparatively hot moment where we're warmer than we typically are, we do see increases in aggression. How does this relate again to anger and all the stuff that we've talked about? A lot of people looking at this heat effect have surmised that it's really a byproduct of the fact that as we get hotter, we sort of misperceive the increased blood flow, the increased kind of laxness of our skin, and then we start to think of it as an indicator that we're angry, we're ready to fight. We've essentially activated this thing called our sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system. And that might lead, if we do have those brief moments of anger or frustration, to us to be more inclined to act aggressively. And all of this, again, highlights how these things might be considered disparate, but they come together and create this really elaborate tapestry that gives us a better sense of what can trigger aggression in some people and a lack of aggression in others. And this is exactly what we're going to be focusing on in our next class. Things that have also been linked to aggression and things that we've studied extensively over the years to better understand sort of the path that people go on when they become more or less aggressive overall. I don't want to foreshadow too much, though. I want you to just make sure that you understand what we've covered here. And then when we come back, we'll get into a lot of really both interesting and controversial topics that have been explored over the years. Until then, take care, and I hope to see you soon.